Sam's 12 Commandments for the Indian entrepreneur, as the title indicates, is targeted towards entrepreneurs from India, whether they are working in India or anywhere in the world. So why do we need a book, and especially a book for entrepreneurs, for the Indian entrepreneur? So that is, I'm sure the first question that will come to your mind when you see the title of this book. There's a very specific reason for that. From the last 35 years of my experience as an entrepreneur, first 20 years in the software industry and then the next 15 years in the genomic industry, and covering many countries, because though I was based in the US, I set up companies or acquired companies in different parts of the world. So I got the real feeling that the people of Indian origin take decisions and act in some particular ways which is very unique. And thinking more about that and analyzing that in more detail, I felt, or I realized, that is due to the, or a large part due to the, what I call the Indian psyche. That is, over the last 3,000 years, the Indian culture has left in all of us Indians a very significant mark. A lot of good things, but some things maybe we need to consider very carefully, especially in the business context. As an entrepreneur, any one of us would be taking decisions, practically many important decisions every day. And so the decision making becomes very critical for the success of the business that you're trying to build. And so the process of the decision making and what are the things that you value most and how that is influenced by your background becomes very important for you to understand. Maybe not to change the decision that you make, but at least to understand that where you're coming from, and will that be a mistake in this world which is more driven by the set of rules and practices that has been set by the Western world. So as a person from the Eastern world, when we are put into this climate, it becomes very important for us to understand where we are coming from. So that is the main theme of the book. I call them commandments, but really they are not really commandments in the real biblical sense. More like, guidelines, or maybe even you can call them rules. And basically the book focuses on the Indian entrepreneur, the first time Indian entrepreneur. So some of the rules may not be really that applicable if you already become successful in your first or second companies and you're looking at the next innings. Feel free to break them. But otherwise, I would suggest that you really think through very, very carefully before you break the commandments. The beginning of the book, in the introduction part, I put the context of India. Nobody will argue that India is growing so rapidly. The economy in a few years will become the third largest economy in the world, just behind US and China. But at the same time, we are in a world that is controlled by these two large powers. So I cover that aspect of where India fits in the global context of the sort of declining America and the rising China. So we are the third, or we will be the third, but we will be a sort of a distant third. So how do we fit in and how do we manage from a national perspective? Secondly, as maybe the most populous country in the world now, we will be contributing the largest to the future damage of our planet. Everybody agrees that the last 100 or 200 years, the industrial revolution really helped us multiply and become grow into a very large number, but that has created so much toxicity, so much pollution, and we have ruined a large part of the earth in many different ways, and the oceans. So and that is bound to increase as more than 1 billion people from India also start consuming in the way the Western world has consumed in the last few decades. And so I bring up the concept of the new revolution that is going to come up through biology, through the developments in biology. The previous 2 centuries were driven by developments initially in chemistry and then in physics, which led to so many of the dramatic inventions that we saw in the last 200 years. But the next 100 years is going to be driven by genomics and genomics driven biology, developments in biology. So I cover that and I call that the bio wave. So the bio wave is going to is to be like a tsunami in slow motion. So it's going to hit a lot of areas, industries that you never even thought of, and will change our lifestyles from food to healthcare to agriculture and many industries that is going to change. And that will also be very helpful in reducing pollution, in also cleaning up the earth, and in the sense that there are so many microbes that we can use to maybe even eat plastics, and clear up oil spills, and that way it can even go back and we can make our earth more pristine again. So that is something which I emphasize a lot in the introduction chapter. So as we get to the second chapter, I look a little more deeply into the decision making part, what I mentioned briefly earlier of the Indian psyche. How did the Indian psyche develop in the last 3,000 years, starting from the Vedic age, then getting into the what we think as the golden age of Buddhism and Jainism and the Upanishads, and then moving on to the Middle Ages, the beginning of the Dark Ages, and then coming under the colonialism. So I divide that into those 5 sections, and then look at how our psyche changed, how our culture changed, and how that left such a strong imprint in our minds, and that is so important for us to clearly understand and help us in taking the decisions that we have to take on a daily basis, which I will address in each of the commandments. So the first commandment is know thyself, which I take from the Greek oracles. Anybody before becoming an entrepreneur, especially at this stage when India is changing so dramatically and there is so much direct and indirect pressure, or even in the positive things of being an entrepreneur, and so many people are rushing to it. What maybe 20-30 years would have been seen as a very risky thing to do is now seen as a very good thing to do and a glorious thing to do, which is true in one aspect, but maybe not the right thing for everybody. So that is what the aspect I ask, mostly questions that you need to think about. Your risk profile, this is the right time for you to do this. What will happen if it fails? Typically in India, it's very difficult to close a company. So it's not like you can start a company and after 6 months or 12 months feel that, oh, this is not the right thing for me, and move on. That becomes very difficult, a lot of the baggage that you carry. So I explain that in detail and challenge you to really think about the timing. Maybe it might be good for you to work for a few years before you start a company. And a little earlier in the book, I talk about the type of entrepreneurs too. So I don't think entrepreneurs can be lumped into one single bucket. So I divided them into 4 types. And there are actually maybe even more, but at least at a higher level about 4 types. And so you can see like which type you are, or a combination of types that you are, and whether you should be getting into this, becoming an entrepreneur in the first place. The second commandment we get into is that choose the idea with the best potential, not the one that you're most passionate about. This might seem a little contradictory because we are always told or advised to follow your passion, and especially entrepreneurship is such a tough job, and it is going to be very hectic the next few years once you get into your first company or build your first company. So it might feel like the one that you are most passionate about, that idea is the best. But I would urge you to think through a little more, because passion is easy to come because you can be moved by many things like global warming or a species going extinct. All those are like important things, but are your idea or the one that you're going to build your company on, is that the best potential for you, especially as your first time entrepreneur? Is that the one that is most likelihood for success? And sometimes the idea may be great, but are you at the right place? Globally, the geography plays a lot of importance in the success of an idea. And do you have the right resources to go and build that? So be very careful in choosing the first idea. So we get to the third commandment, assemble the right founding team. As I mentioned earlier, entrepreneurship is going to be a very tough journey and a commitment. There will be at least 5 to 10 years of your time is going to go into the company that you are embarked upon to build. And typically it needs many skills. So most of the time it will be ideal if you have a good set of people with you. If possible, right at the beginning of the company when you start. If not, at least focus on getting good early employees. Some of them you can convert as say equivalent to founders, and that brings in multiple skill sets, that reduces the risk. And of course you will have to spread your equity a little bit, but it is worth it in ensuring that your founding team is capable. And at every stage later in the journey, you will see that whether it is to attract the investment and whether it to go through the various stages, the life cycle of the company, the team that you have will be your biggest strength. This commandment of never bringing your spouse to the startup is something I know will not be agreeable to many of you, because especially in India, with the Indian mindset, we can see a lot of people, the husband and wife coming up together and starting the company. As a first-time entrepreneur, I would very strongly discourage that. Why? Couple of reasons. First of all, like I mentioned earlier, it's a very risky proposition. There's a very good chance that your company may not succeed. So why should two people take the same risk in the same family? You have to have a buffer which will give you actually more strength. If the other person is getting a steady income, you don't have to worry too much about the daily expenses and your survival. So that is the first primary reason which I would say that it's better for the first time entrepreneur not to have the spouse in the same startup. Second reason is that it's a very stressful process building a company. And the 10 to 12 hours that you spend in your work time in building the company will have, you will be handling a lot of problems. And if you're going to come back to the house and then discuss the same thing, it will make your life even more miserable. So if you keep it apart, this will give you, much more comfort when you get back home. You can talk about other things and not the business things, and the same problems won't be bothering both of you at the same time. Actually, there's one more point that makes it important or important to consider why not to have the spouse in the startup, is that it makes the other people in the company also a little uncomfortable, especially when there are issues to handle. Maybe it can be performance related issues, maybe it can be perceived other issues, and your partners, your investors, your employees will find it very difficult to address. How do they bring it up? How do you handle it? And even if they bring it up, how do you solve it? So all that can create severe problems. So all that is completely avoided if you don't have the spouse in the startup, in your same startup. Bring in the CFO early. This is a very important and a big gap that you see in practically any Indian startup, whether in India or anywhere in the world. In the first innings when I was in the software industry, I would have acquired about 8 companies, and for that process I had to go through more than 100 companies, and I had to shortlist and find the right companies to acquire. And whenever there was an Indian founder, whether it was in Japan or whether it was in UK or US or India, you will find the CFO missing. While if you look at a US company, even a small company, CFO would be one of the first people in the company, either as a co-founder or as one of the early employees. And that brings in a lot of value to the company, in the sense that these are not traditional family-owned businesses where the owner holds the cash box, right? These are all companies that are professionally built and needs to go in a professional manner, where you have to get in investors or your company has to get merged or acquired, and good financial systems and processes in the company become so important. Otherwise, I often see the value of companies going down significantly, Indian origin companies or Indian founded companies during the due diligence, when there are so many missing gaps, there are so many mistakes. And in India, you will find not only even in startups and small companies, even when the companies grow to a mid-size, you often see the CEO playing the role of the CFO, which is pretty harmful. So one more point to add to the bringing the CFO is the challenge that most of you would face, especially in India, that is very difficult to get a good CFO. You get good finance managers, but difficult to find good CFOs because the practice itself has not been there. So it's a question of the chicken or the egg. but at the same time, I come out with some solutions, some intermediate steps, which you can see on how to manage the process of getting a CFO. Biggest step that a startup reaches after the first months or first year would be to get an external funding agency to come and support you. Most probably you would have gone through the first 2 stages of your own capital, then maybe friends and family, and now we are looking to get into a professional investor, bringing in a professional investor into the company. So a big landmark, and a lot of challenges that arise with that. So typically I look at the first 2-3 steps of funding, or 2-3 rounds of funding, I would say. You would go to an angel fund most probably the first time, and India now has a number of angel funds, so you can get the angel or seed funding, and the challenges and how to align yourself to the right funding agency I cover in that. And at the next stage you get to the venture capital companies, who would be then giving you the second round of funding, and then the different set of challenges that you face. And after that you go to the either larger VCs or private equity companies for your Series C or Series D. So at every time it becomes very important for you to get the right funding, because there are a lot of differences of opinion that can arise between you and your founding team and the investors. Why is that? See, the investor is coming with a different perspective. They are coming to, initially it seems very aligned. They want to make you succeed, you want to make the company succeed, and both of you are outwardly looks aligned. But when you go a little more deeper, you will see that there can be many different forces that are pulling in. Maybe not that much for the angel investor, because if he's really an angel, he is not really that worried about, his priority won't be his returns immediately or even in the long run. He really wants to give back something, and he wants to make sure that you also succeed. But if you go to the next stage of a larger investor, you are one of the portfolio companies, right? And so your success, he's not fully bound with your success. He wants to really make sure that few of the companies in the portfolio really succeed, and it is difficult for him to support all. So they can only support the ones that they feel are growing well, meeting the metrics that they have internally, and then make sure that those companies are supported well. If they spread their funds that they have too thin, they might end up with a lot of companies which are not successful or mediocre. So as most VCs have principle that they know that 2 or 3 companies in a portfolio is really going to make it big. So if they have 10 companies, there are 4 or 5 companies that they're really going to support. So you really need to understand the perspective of the funder. And typically many of the funding agencies are not using their money. They'll be using money that they have raised from outside. So you should be really aware of what are the sources of funds, what is the timeline that they have, because they need to sell their investments and return the money back. So the fund may be a 7-year fund, maybe a 5-year fund, maybe a 10-year fund, and what stage are they in that fund? So how much time will they be giving you to become successful, and how much money do they have also to give you some subsequent rounds of funding? So all those points become very important. And then the value of the company, what is the valuation that they are going to come in for? And ironically, sometimes it may be even better to go for a little lower valuation if it is a right funding company, right one that you need to go with. Because you might be very excited at getting a very high valuation initially, but what happens to the subsequent rounds? Because if you're not able to then give the return on that, you might even have to take a down round, which will be a big hit to you and to the investors. So a lot of things have to be considered when you choose every round of funding. When you're getting into an industry, you will often be more influenced by the other startups, because they are the ones that who make a lot of noise and be having press releases, having events, and having various kind of announcements. And you tend to get confused or upset with the developments that are happening there. But I would urge you to ignore most of that and urge you to look at the larger players in that segment, so which I call the gorillas. And typically in any industry there will be 3 or 4, maybe even 1 or 2 large gorillas. These are the large companies which act very quietly, so you may not really see them making much noise. And if you compare this with the scenario of a forest, this is the gorilla and the monkeys. The monkeys make a lot of noise, and the gorillas look like they are practically sleeping or minding their own business, but their actions can affect you significantly. So a couple of examples I give in my experience were the actions of gorillas, whether they are either intended at you or maybe not, but either way affects the business significantly. And in the Indian case especially, the government itself is the biggest gorilla. So a government policy change or a new decision can affect you. So you have to keep that in mind and be very watchful on the actions and the steps that the gorillas are taking. Hold on to your equity. So now again, as an Indian, typically we feel like, okay, making money is not the most important thing. And so entrepreneurs in the first innings or first company typically pay very little attention to the equity that they're holding. They think that, hey, it will all happen. If I do the right things, the right thing will come to me. That's what the Indian culture tells us. But in business, that is not often the case. It all goes by clear agreements that are put in place. And the shares that you hold become very, very significant, because that's the most important thing of value to you. And if after putting 5 to 10 years of effort into it, if you get diluted so much at each round of funding that you might turn out to be a very small minority shareholder at the end of the day, with at the same time holding all the responsibilities of running and building the company. That is one significant reason for that. The second important reason is that I mentioned earlier about the misalignment that can often happen between you. When I say you, I mean you and your founding team, you and the other players, whether it is the other investors or even employees or important customers, in the sense that if you don't have control, you won't be able to take the important decisions that everybody may not agree upon. Maybe going on a new path, maybe going to a new geography, maybe cutting down some lines of business, whatever you need to do. So if you have to do all that, you have to have control. So I put the golden rule inside this commandment, that at least up to the first 5 years, you should have more than 50% of the equity. Otherwise, you won't be able to control the destiny of your company. Mediocrity is worse than failure. Unfortunately, as we all build our companies, a lot of times the company slips into mediocrity. It doesn't happen overnight. It's a slow process due to many factors, the environment, maybe some of the decisions that you took, maybe competition, whatever the reason. The company slowly becomes like a Me Too company. You might argue, or many people might say, so what is really that wrong with that? I wouldn't disagree in that. If it is, you are okay with that and you analyze that and say like, yeah, I am prepared to be a boutique company, or I will be a lifestyle company. This supports my lifestyle and I'm happy, and I will continue with this company even if it's not going to become a big company or make a mark. But at the same time, there are a couple of important things that you need to think through before you slip into that. The first one is that, hey, what about the investors? What about the employees who all jumped into this depending on you and your vision? And if you're going to give them not give them an exit, not give them the returns, that is pretty sad. Secondly, you need to think about is that, hey, what about your own capabilities? We start life with a set of cards, and if you are not able to play that cards well to the best of our abilities, that is sad. So you have to really think through and be very alert to see whether the company that you're building is slipping into mediocrity. But more importantly, I suggest many ways by which how can you get out of that mediocrity, okay, with real examples, even in my particular personal case and in other cases that I have seen, on what are the steps that you can do to move out of that. As an entrepreneur, you have to commit fully, but many of us don't think much about the exit. So what I say is that be prepared for the exit and take clear efforts to plan for that. This again is very counterintuitive for Indians. Even in many companies when I started in India, people think that it's a family business. After me, my children will take over and that's the way it would go. Some people like that. I mean, again, I'm not saying, never in this book am I being judgmental. So, it's up to you to take a decision. If you think that this is my company, this is my one and only love, I am going to be here and do this for the rest of my life, again, there is nothing wrong with that. But Then again, the questions that I discussed previously about the mediocrity part, you have to really think through about the others in the system. Will you be able to really take care of your investors? Will you be able to give the returns, adequate returns, give them an exit without you exiting, which is perfectly okay? Which you be able to convert the stock options that you have given to your employees? Will they be able to convert that into value? So if they are able to do all that, it's perfectly fine. Otherwise, most of the time you will find that is very difficult without really selling the company or taking it an IPO, having a clear exit plan. So I recommend that you think through at a much early in the stage of company building itself what will be the potential lines of exit, and not to reduce your commitment to the company, to building the company, but to be ready and be prepared for a good exit. And I also say, as a follow-on, there's a lot of other benefits of an exit too. So you think when you build a company that this is the only thing and this is what I have spent my sweat and blood, and what can I do without it? But you can do a lot of things. You can do a second innings, you can take a break. Now you can really go back to maybe build something that you're so passionate about. So you get that nest egg that gives you much more freedom. The commandments that you saw till now was mostly about building your company and then finally reaching the exit. Now we come to the last two commandments. This 11th one is relearn to learn. So here is also a very important thing from an Indian perspective, that most of us or many of us sort of forget learning. You can blame a lot of it on the institutions, the education institutions that we have here. Not only here, most parts of the world, all driven by the earlier industrial revolution, when it was like a mass mode of teaching people. While we all know, all of us learn differently, nobody is the same, and somebody picks up things faster or a different way of learning. Our brain is wired differently. So the neurophysiology of learning is something that needs to be explored. But more importantly, most of us have lost the joy of learning. Our educational system has made it so bad that by the time we are out of college, we are like fed up. You don't want to learn anything more. And you also think that, hey, my major part of learning is over. Now I have to just read a few books and read in the paper and I'm enough. But the world has changed. It's a knowledge industry. There are so many new things coming up. So if you don't not only continue learning, but if you also don't change the process of learning, so the way you learn, it's going to be very difficult for you to stay abreast. So I say, if you don't read, you can't lead. So an entrepreneur, you are a leader, you are leading. So as a leader in the knowledge industry, you have to know more than most of the people around you. So if you don't know that, you won't be able to lead. So that relearning is something, and I give examples again of how I built completely a genomics based companies after moving from software. So how I learned a new subject, and similarly anybody can do that. We come to the last commandment, Tattvamasi. So we started with the Greek oracle, now we get to the Upanishads, and you can see the Tattvamasi written very well if you go to Sabarimala. So Tattvamasi really means you are that. But I don't really go into the original sense of that, because and we are allowed to do that, so nobody should get upset about it. It's one of the Maha Vakyas where everybody is allowed to sort of bring in their own interpretation of that. So the original thought of you are that is, you are part of the cosmic, the Brahman and your soul, and how you are all part of that. But I bring in a different meaning in this commandment. I feel that what you are that, meaning like you are what you can imagine yourself to be. So, how is the universe and what is your place in the universe, right? And as an entrepreneur working a lot and building a company, you often might think, what's the purpose of all this? Why am I doing this? And so I try to answer some of those questions. And I also make a little bit fun on other authors like Paulo Coelho, who mentions that, if you want something very bad, the universe will conspire to make that happen, which I beg to disagree. I don't think the universe bothers that much or any much about what each one of us does. So it will be really up to us to plan and decide what you want to be. And not only in building the company, but as an individual, and what you are going to give back to the society, and your contributions and your legacy. And so that's where I end the book with. So as I mentioned before, I moved from software to genomics, and the last 15 years I had a wonderful journey in building companies based on genomics. So I was very lucky actually to ride two waves. The first wave was my first innings when the IT industry was starting to boom, and I got a chance to build a couple of companies in that phase. But at that time I was more like the type A entrepreneur that I explained in the book, young, with very little money, very little experience. But when I was able to start my second innings, I had some money and I had more experience, and I could do it very differently. So many of the commandments that I mentioned in the book I used in my second innings. So I learned genomics, took me 4 or 5 years. I realized that this is going to change the world. This is, I thought, the biggest discovery that our species had done, to sequence the genome and find the code. So getting the code through genomic sequencing completely changes everything. So, and another important realization that all species, every living organism in the world shares the same DNA. So it is like one language. There is no multiple languages as we use in software. But as you know, all software languages finally get converted to machine language. The computer understands only 0 and 1. So somewhat in a similar way, all DNA finally is just 4 letters. 4 chemicals make the DNA. So if you sequence any organism's DNA, you get a series of 4 letters in different order. So that makes up the genome. And that's a complete blueprint based on which the whole organism is born, developed, and lives. So, and that is the same for every living thing. So all the tools that you need for sequencing the DNA, for analyzing the DNA, and understanding what the genes are, what the genes do, all that is the same. The tools are the same. So that gave me a good opportunity to build up an incubator company. My first company in this innings was a company called Genome, where I built the main skills for this, DNA sequencing and data analysis. And using that as a base, as a horizontal, I built verticals on top of it, various companies, one at a time. So first I built the lowest lying apple looked at. It seemed to be medical diagnostics, because healthcare is an important thing, and genetic diagnosis was giving a lot of new tests which are not available at all till then. So now we could know if a child is born with a serious disease, what happened, and will the next child get it? So these are important questions that a parents needed to answer. Then similarly, cancer is very much a genetic disease. I didn't mean inherited disease. So it is just genetic mutations, though about 10% of the cancers are inherited. So all this gave rise to a set of new tests. And I was lucky to lead the genomic revolution in India, and we were the first company to bring in genetic testing based on genomic sequencing in India. And that MedGenome, for the next few years, raised over $120 million and became the leader in genomic diagnostics in India. I did a few other companies also, but that's not the important part here. So what I was trying to say is that in the appendix is that we can now break our genetic destiny. So till now, any species, including the humans, had no choice about the cards that they were dealt with. When you're born, you get a set of genes, half from the mom and half from the dad, and a few mutations that happen by accident, and you're stuck with it. So now the technologies have come, the first set which I mentioned, the reading the genome, the sequencing part of it, so we can now know the letters and which letter went wrong, and what is that causing, which disease that is causing. Now the next step that will soon come is to edit that. So this is already not a futuristic thing, already there. In the US, clinical trials have already started on looking at embryos, or even looking at babies, and looking to see if editing a gene can fix a disease. And some of this is in phase 1 trials. So you will see over the next few years many developments happening by which serious diseases are eradicated through genomic editing. Of course, it creates a lot of bioethics issues, ethical issues, because initial efforts might be just to fix diseases, but humans have never been wise to handle power. So there might be often tendencies now to what they call blue-eyed babies or different type of babies that you might want, and people might cross the border and try to do other things which they want their baby to be. So that is a very difficult challenge that we will have to face. Secondly, we might also try, even nations might try to create people with the superhuman abilities and things like that. So different challenges that society will have to answer. But the genie is out of the box, so there is much better for us to address them openly than pretend that those are not there. And gene editing is already earlier in the last 10 years, 15 years have made a big mark in plants, and animals and microbes and all that, and which often got stalled at many times due to opposition against that, which some of it is real worries. Whenever a new technology is there, we have to be worried, but a lot of it was misguided and not understanding what is really being done now and what are the impact of that, and that has also stalled that, and India has lost out. So we will have to be really now proactive and take the leadership in figuring out how we are going to handle these new technologies, and what are the shapes and ways by which we will guide this. So those are things that I explore in the appendix, and I also predict that practically maybe our species as Homo sapiens has a very little time left. Maybe another 30-40 years we will have evolved into a different one or two, or I don't know, any number of species in different directions.